The launch of the Wii in 2006 was a huge moment for Nintendo. The previous two console generations had seen them fall behind both of the industry newcomers. Sony and their PlayStation 1 and 2 dominated everything, and Microsoft and their Xbox pushed their way into second place despite having no previous experience or IP to call their own. Nintendo hadn't been in a market-leading position in the home console space since the SNES a decade before, and while they had found massive success with handhelds, it was perhaps time to mix things up a little. Codenamed Revolution, work on the successor to the GameCube began not long after it was released. It was confirmed very early on that Nintendo had no plans to compete with Microsoft and Sony on a hardware level, with Shigeru Miyamoto stating that they planned to utilise innovative gameplay concepts over raw horsepower, citing Dance Dance Revolution and the unique method of controlling the game as an example. Satoru Iwata, the president of Nintendo at the time, instructed Miyamoto to ignore the usual roadmap for their upcoming console, stating he wanted the console to be appealing to mothers and to reduce clutter in the home through the method of backwards compatibility, enabling Nintendo's past releases to be played on the console. These philosophies, focusing on innovation and accessibility, turned out to be right on the money. The design of the Wii's hardware was primarily led by Genyo Takeda, the general manager of Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division. He'd been a staunch critic of the typical console development model, largely against the process of simply making everything faster and shinier each generation, rather than innovating in other ways. He often compared console development to that of the automotive industry, stating that cars aren't designed and built to be high-performance racing machines, and that those made for the general masses often have different priorities in mind. Takeda took this approach when designing the hardware of the Wii, focusing on scaling back the power of the console while aiming to maintain a good level of performance. This was a benefit for Nintendo on multiple fronts. Primarily though, low-powered components tend to cost far less than their cutting-edge alternatives, meaning that the production costs of the console could be kept lower, resulting in savings that could be passed on to the customer. It's difficult to say exactly how much of a power deficit the Wii had compared to the Xbox 360 or PS3, but it's around half as powerful, and this is quickly made apparent when taking a look at how the console operated. Nintendo focused on standard definition graphics for the Wii's games, with the console itself only outputting 480p over composite or component, something that would become a point of criticism due to HDMI and 720p becoming the standard shortly after. A cheap and easily available adapter such as a Wii 2 HDMI can convert the Wii signal to 720p for easier use on modern TVs. The console itself still performs at an internal resolution of 480p. This lower operating resolution leads to an image that isn't the sharpest when viewed on a modern TV. An IBM PowerPC Broadway chip powered all of this, twinned with an ATI Hollywood GPU. Both of these run at a relatively low clock speed and have access to a paltry amount of memory compared to the other consoles that it competed with. Developers made the most of it though, especially Nintendo's in-house teams, producing some games that look great considering what they had to work with. Physical copies of these games shipped on discs, and for the first time in Nintendo's history, uses a standardised format for media. The Wii optical disc was DVD based, and such massively increased the amount of space available for developers over the carts and GameCube discs used previously, and massively reduced the costs that resulted in shipping a physical game due to their low price to manufacture. Digital distribution made its way to a Nintendo home console for the first time too, this being a perfect way for Nintendo to make good on its idea of getting older titles into the hands of the customer without having multiple consoles under the TV. Of course, digital distribution meant that storage for the console needed to be increased. The GameCube's 8MB memory cards, while still compatible with the Wii for GameCube titles, weren't going to be sufficient to store much more than a few saves at most, and downloaded games were completely out of the question. 512MB of internal flash memory was a part of the console for storing save games and smaller titles from the new online store. This could be expanded through an SD card, massively increasing the storage capacity of the system for a relatively low cost due to being a widely available storage solution. Nintendo didn't only embrace digital distribution for the first time, but the internet as a whole. Online play was now fully featured and available to any game that wanted to support it through the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection service. This also included the Wii Shop channel, a store for purchasing and downloading games, demos, trailers, and updates. Wii Points were used to purchase content, a digital currency that could be bought in stores or online in various values, ranging from 100 to 5,000, with 1,000 points costing roughly $10, in a very similar way to the one used by Microsoft for the Xbox 360. Around the same time that the GameCube launched, Nintendo partnered with Gyration, a company that had previously worked on motion sensing technology. This early partnership was to design prototypes of potential future controllers for Nintendo. An early idea for the controller aped the DS's touchscreen interface, with a prototype being designed and produced. However, it was decided that having two almost identical control methods for their two consoles would be a detriment, especially if the DS, released 2 years before the Wii launch, had failed, and as such the concept was scrapped. Miyamoto headed up the design of the new controller, using what had been learned from the prototypes developed by Gyration. The final design is similar to that of a remote control for a TV or DVD player, albeit with far fewer buttons, and as such was branded the Wiimote. Motion controls remained the primary method of control on the Wiimote. A series of accelerometers were used to determine motion along the three axes, and an optical sensor was used to accurately track the direction the controller was facing, using a sensor bar rather than the TV to track it, something that was becoming increasingly necessary due to the increasing popularity of flat-screen TVs, which don't work with traditional methods used by light guns. The sensor bar would sit atop or beneath the TV and use infrared LEDs to track the general direction of the Wiimote. Motion controls in games were a far cry from what is seen accompanying VR headsets these days, and while the Wiimote did a commendable job, it wasn't the most accurate of devices in the world, often misinterpreting the user's motions that led to a lot of random waggling in some games. This was improved somewhat in 2009 with the release of the Wii Motion Plus, a small add-on device connected to the expansion port at the bottom of the Wiimote, enabling more complex motions to be recognised. A year later, a new version of the Wiimote was released that incorporated the Motion Plus accessory directly into the device. A large list of games from its release supported the new accessory, with a handful requiring its use, most notably Zelda Skyward Sword and Red Steel 2. A lot of games bypassed the motion controls entirely and stuck with a regular controller. The expansion port at the bottom of the controller could be equipped with a variety of different accessories too, the most common of these being the nunchuck and classic controller. The nunchuck was a small accessory designed to be held in the player's offhand. It featured an analog stick and two trigger buttons. It was generally used in conjunction with the Wiimote. The addition of an analog stick was extremely necessary for a lot of 3D games that would have been borderline impossible to play without it. The same motion sensor of the main Wiimote also lived inside the nunchuck, allowing for even more control in supporting games. The classic controller was more or less exactly what the name implies, a somewhat unergonomic controller with 4 face buttons, D-pad, shoulder buttons and a pair of analog sticks. It was primarily designed for playing Nintendo's back catalogue of titles from the NES through to the N64, but generally worked on regular Wii titles so long as they supported modern controls. The main downside of the classic controller was that it was completely dependent on the Wiimote to connect to the console. It didn't connect directly via USB or a custom port. It had to be connected to the Wiimote and then to the console wirelessly, meaning your Wiimote batteries were draining even when not using it. The release of the Classic Controller Pro remedied some of the issues present in the Classic Controller. It was essentially the same, except it had grips either side now to be actually comfortable when used by humans. The sticks were further apart, and the cable now exited the control at the top rather than the bottom. It did still require a Wiimote for use, however, unfortunately not addressing the biggest problem with a non-Pro model. The Wii hit the streets in 2006, first in North America on November 19th, and 2 weeks later for the rest of the world, and was an immediate success. It launched at $250 in the US and £180 in the UK, which was absurdly low for a new console. Included with the console was a Wiimote and nunchuck, a copy of Wii Sports, and even a vertical stand. Wii Sports' inclusion as a bundled-in launch title eventually led to it being the biggest selling game on the system, with over 80 million units sold. It was a perfect introduction to the Wii and how it worked. The included games of tennis, bowling, boxing, golf and baseball were all instantly recognisable, and it's almost always immediately apparent what the player has to do with the Wiimote in order to play. Its simplicity instantly connecting with a more casual demographic and massively contributing to its early success. It became Nintendo's largest launch in history and comfortably outsold the Xbox 360 and PS3 in the window around launch. In the month and a half between the release of the Wii and the end of 2006, Nintendo shipped 3.2 million units around the world, and within a year and a half had sold more consoles than Microsoft had with their Xbox 360. For the first time in over a decade, Nintendo was back on top. The launch of the Wii wasn't necessarily all smooth sailing, however. Shortages of the console became prevalent as consumer demand began to outweigh the manufacturing capability of Nintendo, and as such, the Wii became very difficult to acquire for an extended period. Unlike previous generations, Nintendo had a vast array of games available at launch, with over 20 titles being available on day one across the various regions. Many of these were ports of games that already existed on other platforms, such as Call of Duty 3 and Need for Speed Carbon, and there was a decent selection of games aimed at younger players, with titles like Rayman Raving Rabbids and SpongeBob. An enhanced port of Zelda Twilight Princess, now with motion controls, was front and centre on day one, and red steel covered the more hardcore gamer demographic. The lack of a Mario title, or more conventional Nintendo IP beyond a Zelda port at launch, would have been a red flag in previous years, but Nintendo made it work this time around. Nintendo's biggest problem over the previous couple of generations had always been third-party support. It was borderline non-existent for the N64 due to the continued use of cartridges, and while the GameCube had a better time of it, the PS2 and Xbox had a massive amount of third-party support by comparison. It's in this respect that the Wii had a much better time of things. Over the lifetime of the console, it amassed north of 2,500 titles, over 4 times that of the GameCube. That being said, the quality of these games was often questionable. In stark contrast to Nintendo's previous quality control stance, the Wii became a platform of shovelware. For every Mario Galaxy, there was a dozen Alvin and the Chipmunks. Major publishers like EA, Ubisoft and Activision got behind the Wii, or at least the Wii's huge install base, seeing the potential for sales and pumped out plenty of games for the system. Many of these games were essentially the same as their counterparts on the PS3 and Xbox 360, albeit with significantly reduced graphical fidelity, and often some kind of token Wiimote gimmick, but some ended up being completely different games altogether, sharing only a name. The Wii's game library was further boosted by it being fully backwards compatible with the GameCube, at least until a 2011 redesign of the console removed the feature from new consoles. Internally, the Wii had what was essentially a complete GameCube chipset, meaning that games running on it were virtually flawless when compared to running on their original target hardware. The backward compatibility extended to accessories as well as software. One of the Wii's sides had a door running along its length that, when opened, revealed a set of 4 controller ports and 2 memory card slots. Your original GameCube controllers could even be used on specific Wii games, such as Super Smash Bros. Brawl. This is still the most convenient way of playing GameCube games today, aside from possibly emulation. As alluded to before, the Wii received several new models throughout its life. The first of these was released in 2011 and cut back on several features to reduce the price of the console. GameCube backwards compatibility was completely removed. This included the controller ports along the side of the console, so to use them in Smash, an adapter would have to be bought. The vertical stand was also cut, as this model, sometimes referred to as the Wii Family Edition, was designed to be used horizontally. Visually, this version looked the same as other early consoles, albeit without the door for the GameCube accessories. The cuts allowed Nintendo to get the price down to $150, a drop of $50 from the current price at the time. A year later, a revision dubbed the Wii Mini was released. This smaller, red console continued to cut features. Along with the GameCube backwards compatibility and stand, online functionality was completely removed. It wasn't possible to access the Wii Shop, play online, or even download game updates. The SD card slot was also removed, and even the disk tray couldn't escape from being slimmed down, with a top-loading drive being incorporated. Perhaps the most egregious removal was that of the component video output, limiting the Wii Mini to composite and 480i output. All of this took the price down to $100 for a new unit. The Mini, unlike the Family Edition revision, wasn't designed to replace what was currently on the market and was seen as a cheaper alternative for those wanting to try out the console, or for someone wanting a second console for whatever reason. Reviews for it at the time lamented the feature cuts, and generally considered it to be not worth it over the traditional full-size model. A combination of being incredibly affordable right out of the gate and having an almost universally recognisable control method helped massively. It was immediately apparent what the Wii was and how it worked. That alone did a great job of onboarding new players. I can't think of any other console that had multiple generations playing together seamlessly. Wii Sports acted as the perfect introduction. The colossal library of games generally meant that there was something for everyone, and while a lot of the titles were shelf filler that could be safely skipped by most people, there was a lot of good stuff there too. Mii's were a unique feature at the time, predating Microsoft's implementation of personalised avatars by several years, and the fact that a large number of games supported them was a pretty nice feature. All of this was often countered by a few key points though. While the motion controls were incredibly accessible and made getting started with the console a breeze, they were often inconsistent, inaccurate, and frequently less enjoyable than using a regular controller. Token Wiimote waggling became prevalent in many titles that contributed to this, and was largely incredibly unnecessary. As I mentioned before, for every game worth buying on the system, there were dozens of shovelware titles that could be safely skipped. The days of a smaller but carefully curated Nintendo library were long gone. A lot of it being aimed at a younger audience didn't help the stigma that Nintendo consoles had as being machines for kids. This was furthered even more with a general marketing push labelling the Wii as a console for the casual gamer, a relatively large pivot from their previous stance. Graphically, the Wii was no powerhouse, being far closer to its predecessor, the GameCube, than any of the other current-gen offerings from Sony and Microsoft. While the console supported component cables and 16:9 aspect ratios, the max output resolution was restricted to either 576i or 480p. The lack of HD support was a very valid and major criticism of the console throughout its entire life. This is still one of the biggest limitations and roadblocks to using a Wii today. Composite and component connectivity on modern TVs isn't anywhere near as widespread as it was in 2006, rendering the console almost unplayable unless you grab a thankfully inexpensive HDMI adapter. The Wii was often seen as a divisive console in the eyes of both the public and media alike. It did a lot of things right though. It was critically and commercially very successful, and comfortably outsold both Sony and Microsoft in the 7th generation, with over 100 million sales, pushing motion controls to the forefront of the games industry, for better or worse. It was eventually discontinued in October of 2017, giving it an 11-year lifespan across its various models and revisions. Thankfully, it's still a very accessible console for a variety of reasons. The sheer number of units sold mean that Wiis are everywhere and can be picked up very cheaply. And aside from a handful of titles that remain expensive, most of the library is affordable, and it's probably still the cheapest and easiest way to play GameCube games these days, aside from emulation. Thank you for watching. If you got this far, please consider leaving the video a like and subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this. What did you think of the Wii? Were you one of the 100 million players, or did you give Nintendo a miss this generation? Let me know down in the comments.